Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Welcome back, engagers, to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And today we have with us Frida. But Frida, before we kick off, are you prepared to engage?
Absolutely. Couldn't be more prepared.
Let's do this, because Dr. Frida Polli is an award-winning Harvard and MIT neuroscientist turned CEO. She was named one of Inc.'s top 100 female entrepreneurs in 2018 and one of Entrepreneur's top 100 powerful women in 2020. Dr. Polli's mission is to help everyone realize their true potential at work by removing bias from the talent matching process and improving job fit. That sounds absolutely amazing. And we know that she is the CEO and co-founder of Pymetrics, or Pymetrics. I'm not sure. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Which is a company that's leveraging behavioral science and AI to make workforce decisions more accurate, fair, and efficient. With global clients including BCG, Kraft Heinz, and Workday, Pymetrics has matched millions of people with their ideal jobs based on their cognitive, social, and emotional behavioral traits. It was named a tech pioneer by the World Economic Forum in 2018. So I'm guessing, engagers, you know why we have Frida with us today. Is there anything, however, that we're missing from your intro, Frida?
No, I think that was absolutely very thorough. So nothing missing.
That sounds amazing. So Frida, we'd like to get to know you a little bit more in the sense not only of all those fantastic accolades, but maybe something more of daily life. What does, a life in Pymetrics with Frida in a day like today or, last week, whatever you want to go for, look like?
Yeah, well, obviously, things have changed quite a bit with the pandemic, which we were just talking about before we started recording. So, post-pandemic, I think, things look a little different in the sense that, we are conducting all of our business or most of our business virtually rather than in person, obviously. But yeah, look, it can mean anything from, talking to clients, doing events, podcasts like these. I have actually scheduled my first in-person events for the summer, which will be kind of interesting to see how those go. Really, and talking a lot about how people can use soft skills and artificial intelligence to really optimize a person's fit to their job. So it really spans the gamut of things, and that's what keeps it interesting, keeps me on my toes. And it's an exciting message to be communicating to the world. So it keeps me engaged.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All that behavioral science, all that AI working there for all of us, basically. That's actually how I feel about what you are doing at Pymetrics. So we want to, we've seen all those accolades, all those fantastic things that you and the company have been doing. But I want to start off the way we always do with a story of actually something that I don't want to say regret, but something that you learned a lesson from. So a fail moment, one of those first attempts in learning. Can you tell us a story of how that went, especially, of course, if it has to do with Pymetrics and the fantastic things you're doing with games and job selection and so on? We'd like to sort of be there with you, especially to take away all those lessons and get some inspiration from that.
Yeah, look, I think the image of an entrepreneur, the image of a tech founder is that it's success, 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 but that's hardly the reality. That's just what you see on LinkedIn. And, the reality is actually there are a lot of, fail moments along the way, right? And I think that that's to be expected. I think if you are not failing, you're probably being too cautious. That's sort of how I would think about things, So I don't know. There's not one in particular that I can point to, but I think there are many, many learning lessons. And, one of the key moments for me in terms of, sort of how I live my life now actually dates back, 20 years ago, really, when I was first starting out in my career, and actually is probably what made me so interested in helping people find their optimal career fit. So, I was an English major in college, and I was also pre-med, and I was, basically had done all the coursework to apply to medical school, took the MCATs, applied to medical school. And the coursework had involved, dissecting animals and doing all sorts of, disgusting things. So, I thought, hey, I've seen the worst of this. But before applying to or during the process of applying to medical school, I worked in what's called a wet lab. So basically we were doing animal surgery, and I literally lasted like 3 weeks, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't deal with blood. Like I had not actually had to interact frequently with blood. And I was like, I don't think I can make it through medical school. This is a disqualifier. And so, so that was and I felt like obviously it was a big failure moment because I had spent all this time and, effort, to pursue something that I then realized was not for me. So, and it was, a fail-ish moment because at the end of the day, I had wanted to study the brain even in medical school. So what I did was say, okay, well, I don't want to be an MD. I'll pursue a PhD, which allows you, in my field of study, the same ability to study the brain. So it was a fail-ish because I was still able to sort of pursue my path. But what I did after that was, before taking all the coursework, because you had to take different coursework, I said, okay, well, let's find, the hardest clinical population that I could ever work with if I get a PhD. And I actually went and worked in a prison for a year. And the thinking was, let's try the, sort of real world experiential part of what I would be doing before sort of doing the theoretical piece. And I think then like fast forward, I thought I actually really was motivated by, trying to help these folks. And I also thought like, hey, if we understand human behavior better and, so on and so forth, we'll be able to help them even more. So went and got my PhD, and the rest is history. But I think the takeaway from me there is, I think whenever you're trying something out, getting as many signals as you can as to whether something is a fit is important, rather than just sort of saying, I know what I want. It's got to, and having some sort of very theoretical, idealized.
It's written in stone.
Yeah, like basically, or not even that, but I think people just don't, like, I didn't know what it would involve to be a doctor, right? And obviously to be a doctor, you have to deal with blood and urine and all sorts of things that, you don't encounter on a daily basis. So the point is, I think, just putting yourself in a position to actually experience what you will be doing way before you commit to doing it, I think is a important life lesson for all of us. So
absolutely, I can completely relate, and not in the sense of realizing beforehand, but I can tell you, I've well, I studied computer engineering to begin with, and the day I graduated was the day I decided I was not going to be a programmer. So you can imagine that it was. I enjoyed it. I really liked it. I thought it was a fun thing to do, but I realized that, like, literally before graduation, it sticks very well when you say the day I graduated, right? Yeah. So I did realize that it was fun, but that I didn't want to spend my whole life, programming.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I decided, well, if I'm not going to spend my whole life programming, why not just start from today and maybe be sort of an interface in that sense? And then I realized, like, it was useful. It's still very useful. I can interface very well with technical teams. Yep. But then I did an MBA. Now I'm working in a business school. I'm teaching as well. So I've done all sorts of things in all sorts of different places. And maybe having some experience beforehand, or being able to see a little bit into the future as you try to do, would have led me into a slightly different career path. That would have been interesting. For sure, not med school. That was something I was very clear about. Without experiencing it on a daily basis, I was already, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting about med school is that I think conceptually science is so interesting, right? I think in any case, like biological science, like all of that is so fascinating. But then the day-to-day of being a doctor, it's a completely different experience, right? And so I think and that's probably true for many careers, right? Where, the theory and the, things that you are learning are so different from what you ultimately end up doing, that I think there's just a big disconnect, so, and that's fine. I mean, you just don't know that when you're, 19 and a college student. I think it's hard to know.
Absolutely. And in fact, you were saying that, and I was remembering when I did computer engineering, so we were engineers, right? So we were supposed to be sort of more in the practice mode than anything. Right. My school was rather more oriented towards theory. And that's not what I wanted. I kind of fought a little bit the school on this. So the thing is, there are sort of two sides to science as well. Like even in computer science, there's a side of people who are creating sort of the science behind it.
Absolutely.
Very, very well said, as well as in medical science, as you did with your PhD.
Yep.
And there's other people as well who might be the same or might not be the same, who are actually applying that and doing that in the real world. And it's two different worlds for sure.
Completely. And, I think what's so interesting, right, is that now, so I then obviously went on to, be a scientist, right, for 10 years and really delve into research, and you learned a tremendous amount. But then ultimately, and I was just, it was fascinating to me. I learned so many things, but then at the end of that sort of period, realized, okay, now I'm sort of filled up with learning, right? I feel like my brain is full, my cup is full, and now what, right? And I think that was an interesting transition as well, because I felt that my best fit is as an applied scientist. I really believe that, which I think is, what a lot of entrepreneurs are, really, is applied, technical folks that are trying to solve oftentimes, a technical problem that there is theory you can draw on, right? But at the end of the day, you're doing it in an applied context, which is very different, right? So anyways, long story short, I think, just having come to that realization is important. And I also think, it's interesting, like the way that people discover careers is a bit haphazard, right? Because nobody in my family at all, really, on either side, had ever been a scientist. And so I was kind of forging my own path. We had business people, we had entrepreneurs, we had lawyers, we had, artists, but no scientists. And so I think, when you don't have, and there weren't a lot of people that I came into contact with growing up that were academics or scientists. And so I didn't have a lot of exposure to what that meant or, what that career looked like. So I think it's just, again, it's part of the problem we're trying to fix is how do you ensure a better fit, and how do you really try to, get as many signals as you can as to like, this path in life is the one. And it, for me, and by the way, I think especially nowadays, like it's not one path, it's many paths, and you are going to be, continually changing.
Yeah, it's a good path for today, maybe not for tomorrow or past year.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of modern work, is that you're not committing to a 30-year, 40-year, 50-year career. You're committing to a couple of years of doing something. Maybe it will last longer than that. I mean, I've been doing Pymetrics now for 8 years, and it still remains, interesting. But I think at the end of the day, it's a wonderful thing that we're no longer committing to a particular company or a particular career, for decades, because, people change, your interests change. And I think it's only normal that you would want to explore other things, so.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that. It's part of the changes that have been happening for a few years, remote working and those things have happened with faster speed recently because of pandemics. But I do think there's many trends that you're talking about there for sure. And Frida, that was a fantastic story of how you turned around that kind of fail moment. Not really. You actually prevented maybe that failure of, passing out, which is probably what would have happened to me
exactly.
in med school. So you prevented that failure and turned out to be the career of your dreams in many ways. And I would like to go actually now for another story. And I'm guessing it has something to do with Pymetrics as well, which is a story of actual success, something that you want to say you're proud of. Maybe it's a project, a particular company that you've worked with, or, maybe it's a story of Pymetrics itself. I don't know. The microphone is yours, so I'll leave it to you.
Absolutely. Well, look, I think having created a company, a successful company that, has a product that people pay money to buy, and employs, 120 people, I think, honestly, that is, from my perspective, one of, if not the biggest sort of career success, certainly one of. I mean, there's nothing really quite like it. It's extremely, I'd almost use the word intoxicating, in the sense that to think you can have an idea and create something is just not something that you can experience outside of entrepreneurship, I don't think. And I think it's the closest thing, the closest feeling you can have in a work context to becoming a parent, in the sense that, when you create, I don't know if you're a parent, but I have 3 kids, and, the first time, I'll never forget getting pregnant and just being sort of just in awe of the fact that a human body could create a living being, even though obviously that's what pregnancy and childbearing is, but when it actually happens to you, you're just kind of blown away. You're like, wow. And I feel it's a similar situation when you start a company, which is that and it's successful and you build a product and people use it. And I don't know, it's just it really is an awe-inspiring process. It doesn't, I think one of the things I would say is that it's not just the founder or the CEO that gets credit or should get credit for that. It really is a team. It's a team of people coming together, believing that it can happen, and really having the mindset. Because, again, I think whether it's, my co-founder at the time or the early team or the later team, each and every one of those individuals is responsible for, it's sort of like a child, right? It takes a village to raise a child. So that is really, I think, at the end of the day, the thing that I'm absolutely the most proud of, is because it's such a creative process. And I don't think that gets enough credit. I think you think of, successful entrepreneurs as building a business, and of course that's what you're doing. But at the end of the day, it's quite a creative process, which I think is really, again, somewhat intoxicating.
Absolutely. And talking about that foundation, those creations, how did you come up with the idea of using games for this? Because I've read a lot about this. I know it's not the only way you do it, but I was especially interested in that. So I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into that one.
Yeah, well, so we call them games, but at the end of the day, it is, well vetted scientific tools that we are using. So we call them games because they're activities that you do on the computer. So people, that's what a layperson would refer to them as. But they are, so how Pymetrics came to be was, I had decided I wanted to do something more applied with the science that I had been learning for the last decade. I applied to business school, I got in. And I was looking for an idea. And, you've been to business school, that a lot of time in business school is spent searching for your next career. So I watched recruiting for 2 years. And really what I realized that it was that what people were trying to understand, what recruiters were trying to understand, and what candidates were trying to understand was not what was in the job description or the person's resume. That was clear. For the recruiter, it was like, who is this person? What are their soft skills? What are their cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes? And they were trying to glean them from the resume, right? So I want someone who's a team player. Let's see if this person has sports on their resume. I want someone who's a hard worker. Let's see if they had a, part-time job while they were in college. But really what you can do is you can actually measure those things in a much more direct way. And that's what we had been developing in the lab for so long, right? Was these tools that were used in scientific experiments to look at things like altruism, which is a precursor to teamwork, or different conditions under which people expend effort, which is essentially precursor to work ethic. So they are games, in quotes, in air quotes, but really what they are is scientific assays. And the idea for Pymetrics came from witnessing recruiting, thinking, okay, what people are trying to understand about folks is not what's on the resume, but instead something much more fundamental about them. And we have a way of assessing that. And we, again, in these scientific exercises.
Absolutely. That makes sense. And that sounds like an amazing story. And it sort of brings me into the next question is, when using Pymetrics to recruit, how does that process work? Because sure. I don't want to ask you about the process for creating a new game, because I'm not sure you're doing that on a regular basis, but how does that, how does Pymetrics work for, let's say, you're a company, a recruiter? How does that go? Yeah.
So basically what we do is, we have, a whole number of different computer activities, exercises that measure a whole bunch of different cognitive, social, and emotional features. And the next thing we need to understand is, at that company, what features make people successful in different roles, right? So that's the training process for the algorithms, is to say, because we don't assume anything going in. We don't assume, a lot of systems will assume, if people are this way, they will always be successful employees. But if they're not that way, they won't. And that's actually the way that a lot of these older assessment technologies were built. And again, I don't think that's a very modern way of thinking about assessment. And it certainly doesn't mesh with what we've found in terms of the data that our system has produced. Essentially, we found that either end of any of the dimensions that we measure can actually be well suited to whatever career you're talking about. It just depends on, the actual career. So essentially what we do first is, have people in the company across a whole variety of job types go through Pymetrics. And that way we can really just aggregate the data and say, hey, people that are successful salespeople look like this, successful engineers look like that, successful such and such look like that. And everybody has a fit. I mean, I think that's kind of the beauty of Pymetrics, is that it isn't a system where, if you don't have these three qualities, you're doomed for failure. It's just about finding your particular role at a company. So that's the first thing we do, is really we profile a wide spectrum of, careers at a company. And that way we determine the profiles that we're looking to match towards. And that's how we can tell the probabilistic estimate of whether you are a, high, medium, or low fit to any particular role. And everybody has fits. I mean, I think that's one thing I want to get across is that unlike many other assessment systems where, again, there's this sort of prescription of, hey, a successful person always has these things, and if they don't have them, they won't be successful. That's really not at all the way we're, creating our technology. It's really everyone has many fits. It's just about helping you find the ones that you're more versus less well suited to. And by the way, that's just one data layer, right? So oftentimes people will use Pymetrics. They'll also use a resume, right? Because they want to understand what your hard skills are. They might use other things as well. So my perspective on all of this is that it really should be a multi-layered approach to understanding somebody's particular, predisposition for a career. Just like what we were saying before, like you want to try to get as much data as you possibly can.
So you're basically working for the company, and then you're evaluating the employees through these games or activities. Again, games are activity. It's like a place where you have a set of rules that restrict you in some way, and you have a series of objectives, which I'm guessing is part of what you have in those activities as well. So I think we can feel comfortable calling them games. Don't worry, Frida.
That's fine by me if we want to call them games. No worries.
So what I was getting at is the approach is you go to the company, and the company you install that process so it understands what success looks like in the company, and then people come in and do the activities. It's not in a way, it's not a marketplace, so to speak. You're not sort of looking for companies and looking for employees at the same time. You're actually working with the company so that Correct. They can sort of obtain employees.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Although we do have the ability to rematch prospective candidates to either roles that they haven't considered or other companies if the company that we're working for allows us to do that. So it's not intended to be a marketplace because, generally speaking, the problem that people are trying to solve, at least in recruiting when they hire Pymetrics, is that I have so many people applying and I want to understand who is best suited for the roles that I have available. It's not that I'm trying to source people. Does that make sense? That's a separate problem. And for that sourcing problem, you would indeed need more of a marketplace approach. But that's not.
And especially because as you were saying, like there's a big pool of people that you're looking for there. But one of the big questions I'm sure that they're facing is this employee going to have, I might do my best and look at the resume and have an interview, but does this employee have good chances to be successful at the organization, or will we have to replace him or her in a year, 2 years?
Exactly. And I think that, again, the reason that this problem became interesting to me was because I was watching this process play out in business school. I mean, again, I'm sure you can relate to this. So, between first and second year of business school, a lot of people take internships, right? And, my observation was that, you're at, the business school at Harvard, everybody's super motivated. Everyone has an idea of what they want to do, and so they're gunning for their internship in, fill in the blank, investment banking, or I don't know, private equity or whatever it is, right? And, they're smart kids. And so they read up on the online resources as to how to, go through your interview successfully and do this and do that. And so they get the internship. And then 2 days later, they're like, I hate this job. And, meanwhile, their friends were like, well, do you really want to be in investment banking? You like to sleep 15 hours a day. I mean, so there was like signs that had they listened to other data sources might have led them to different decisions, right? And so that's part of what I think, led me to think Pymetrics was important. It's not just about the employer having a failure, so to speak. It's actually even more critical, I think, for the candidate to find the right role, because an employer, yes, it's a cost and a this and a that. But at the end of the day, for a candidate, I think it's much harder if, you're not well suited, to the role. So I think if you can make assessment much more about sorting people into the right role rather than just a yay, nay decision, which is unfortunately the way assessment historically has been created. And you can really make it such that all people have many different fits. I think assessment really should work and can work and does work to the benefit of, of the person who is being, in quotes, assessed.
Yeah, going from the lose-lose to the win-win, for sure.
I mean, yeah. And, I think unfortunately, and this is, just my perspective now, having lived in this world for a while, because, honestly, I knew nothing about, personnel assessment before I started Pymetrics. And I think, unfortunately, it has had a bit of a sullied history in the sense that, it has tended to create these tools that then bucket people into sort of winner and loser categories, meaning, traditional assessments are not about fit. They're more about, across entire populations, people with high IQ always do better in all jobs than people with low IQ. Well, that's an extremely dated way of looking at the world, I think. And the only place you're laughing, but it's true. I mean, this is still well-held, strongly held belief in certain circles. And, the research that they point to is literally like 1950s research done, at Bell Labs where somebody stayed for 40 years. Well, maybe in that context, I believe it, right? But that is so far from, the work environment of the present, forget about the future, that I think you really have to question whether that has any relevance to selecting people for employment today. So my point is simply that I think, unfortunately, and again, it's not that the science back then was wrong. It's just that it's very dated and I think it needs to really be refreshed. And unfortunately, it has led, I think, historically to, creating categories of people that are always, thought to be a better fit for all jobs, and then those that are not. And I think it doesn't behoove anyone for that situation to remain, the popularly held belief. Like, I think we have to move away from this belief that certain types of people always do well in all jobs and certain types of people don't, and just say, no, it's really about fit.
Certainly. That makes sense. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And Frida, what would you say in this sort of finding the fit world? Is there some sort of best practice? Of course, using Pymetrics is definitely one of the go-to resources, but is there sort of a best practice? What would you say is something that, in this finding the fit process would be something that probably everybody should be at least trying to do? Yeah, I mean, look, I think, well, it depends on who you're asking, but I think if you're talking about employers, Pymetrics is not the only fit-based system. I think you really, it's important for employers to understand whether something is or is not a fit-based system, and something that's not, basically like an IQ test would not be a fit-based system, right? The IQ, and many, 60% of companies use them. An IQ test basically says people that have, higher IQ do better than those that have a lower one. That's not fit-based. That's basically, it's a unidirectional, and one end of the spectrum is always good, right? So I think just understanding whether the processes that you're using are more fit-based, meaning, they're multi-directional and multi-dimensional. I think those are, critical components for employers. And then, for candidates, I think it's, kind of the same thing. But I think there's more stuff on the candidate side that's fit-based. I mean, all career assessments ultimately at the end of the day are fit-based because that's their whole premise. So I think it's more on the employer side. It's giving up these sort of antiquated belief systems and hiring practices that always give certain types of candidates a leg up. And that's a fantastic best practice. And I would say that their equivalent in education is probably the obsession that we have in tests, right? Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's literally identical because it is. I mean, employment, pre-assessment and employment is basically an employment version of a standardized test. It's essentially the same thing. It's very, very similar. And again, just like in, education, right? Like if you take the SAT or whatever the equivalent is in your geography, nobody's saying, hey, get a middle SAT score, get a low SAT score. Everyone's like, oh my God, you have to get the best SAT score possible, right? And that by definition then creates, essentially winners and losers as opposed to, having a more nuanced way of looking at folks, and again, taking a perspective that's multi-dimensional and multi-directional. So multi-dimension means just you're measuring more than one thing, and multi-directional means that either end of the spectrum of that thing you're measuring could be good or bad. I mean, so for example, right, like in Pymetrics world, I'll just give you an example. So there's some ways that we look at people's attention, right? And so, if you take this sort of antiquated way of looking at people, you might think, well, people that pay attention, you always want to hire those people, and people that are not that attentive, you don't want those people, right? Attentive and impulsive. Well, it turns out there are actually many careers where being inattentive and impulsive is actually a good thing. So sales, for example, like people that are very attentive to detail don't make good salespeople. And the reason for that, I mean, the hypothesis behind that is that
People that are somewhat inattentive, daydreaming, impulsive, tend to be more novelty seeking, right? And more biased to action, which is what you want in a salesperson, right? You don't want an accountant to be your salesperson. You want somebody who's like looking for the next big thing, right? So again, I think that if you were to use a more traditional method of measuring people, you might end up with the wrong answer. If you use something that's more nuanced and comprehensive, I think you end up with a better answer.
Yes, and yes, for sure. That is a great example. In fact, I love that one about, being attentive or inattentive. It's not a good or a bad thing. It's context based for sure.
It's context based. Absolutely. Fit based, context based, however you want to define it.
So Frida, you've heard some of these questions, as well that we do a lot into game design, gamification, and looking at behavioral science to see how we can help people, get motivated, have certain behaviors that they probably want or companies want to help them get and so on. Mm-hmm. Would you say that there is somebody that you would like to listen to answering these types of questions in Professor Game, some future guest perhaps?
I don't know. Can you be more specific?
Sure. So, I mean, after hearing these questions and sort of having a bit of the vibe of the interview, is there somebody that comes to your mind? Like, oh, yes, I would definitely like to hear, I don't know, somebody, one of the first interviews, a friend said, Miyamoto, the guy from Nintendo. Like, I would definitely like to listen to his inspiration and some fail moments. I don't know if there's somebody like that for you.
That's interesting. That's a really good question. I mean, I think earlier in my career, I was more captured by different people that I viewed as, leaders, I guess, in their field. That doesn't mean that I don't care about successful people, and how they became successful. I just think, I don't know. I don't know, Rob. I don't have anything off the top of my head. And not because I don't think it's interesting to hear other people's stories. I think it's more that, I really think that at the end, again, this is going to be a very fit-based answer. I think at the end of the day, finding a successful career is very similar to finding a successful relationship. There isn't a cookbook or a recipe or a pattern that everyone can follow. I mean, there are general best practices like, hey, don't cheat on your spouse. Okay, fine. We can all agree to that, right? Like show up to work. Okay, fine. We can all agree that generally speaking, you should probably show up to work. But beyond these sort of broad generalizations, I think everything is so specific. And so I think I'm more compelled by people that I know in my real life who are not necessarily famous, but who have done things that I'm like, wow, that's incredibly cool. And how do I emulate them? Right. So it's more...
maybe one of those people you know. Okay, I don't want to push it too much. That's fine.
No, I don't care. I'll tell. I mean, again, famous in circles that I hang out in, but there's a man named James Rhee. He's pretty cool. I met him through, some work that a panel basically that we were both on. And, he was recently appointed the endowed chair of entrepreneurship at Howard. He sits on JP Morgan's Advancing Black Pathways Council. He's done, even though he's an Asian gentleman, he has done a tremendous amount to really help to really advance the economic opportunity of communities of color. And so, somebody like that, again, he's not famous or not yet in any case, or not to the level that your audience would necessarily know who he is. But I think, folks like that, I think, it's always fascinating to hear their story. How did you get to where you are? What made you? I mean, he has a fascinating backstory of sort of how he ended up, becoming who he is. So again, it's sort of more local heroes than it is, oh my gosh, I want to hear Obama's. I mean, I love Obama. Don't get me wrong. Like, I think he's amazing, but maybe a little less sort of, again, because I don't aspire to being a politician, maybe less, less interesting in terms of what I can, broadly learn. So.
Absolutely. Actually, that's a perfect recommendation. We've had all of people from all over the place, from all over the planet, from all over, different levels, to people who are very academic, people who are dedicated to teaching in high school and universities and so on, to people who are, practitioners, a mix of practitioners, scientists like yourself. We've had people from all fronts. Many of them not very well known. Maybe they should be better known, as you were saying, but definitely worth sharing their stories and the inspiration that comes from them.
Yep.
So in that same sense of inspiration, is there some book that you would say, well, you should probably read this book to understand, how your feet dipped in the first of your behavioral science? I don't know.
I'm not gonna pull up my Kindle on my phone and be like, what am I reading? Yeah, again, I don't know. I'm not listening and or reading any kind of like autobiographical work. I think, so I'm one of those people that like, I need to fill my brain with other things other than work. And so like when I was a neuroscientist, I never read neuroscience outside of work. I just couldn't do it. Right. And now that I'm an entrepreneur, I don't, read autobiographies of Elon Musk, I don't know. It's just too much. So I'm currently reading a book on viruses called Spillover. Now, that's not particularly motivational, but it is interesting. I'm also fascinated by, cyber threats. And so I've been reading, there's a book called Sandworm, which is really good so again, it's nothing to do with inspirational leadership. It's more just my own idiosyncratic interests. So
that makes sense. It's absolutely good. So thank you very much, Frida, for coming to this interview today. Sorry?
My pleasure.
No, it's been absolutely great. We're really happy to have had you, given your solutions, all that inspiration. You are an inspiration yourself. And so we would like to really thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
But before we let you go, of course, we'd like to know where we can find more about you, about Pymetrics. This is the CTA time, so to speak.
Sure. Sure. You can find all the information you ever want about Pymetrics at Pymetrics, pymetrics.com. And, same with me. You can Google me or, my whole information is on our website. So happy to have anyone connect with me, through Pymetrics.
Fantastic. Thank you very much once again. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you around. And as you know, this podcast makes sense thanks to you. So let's go ahead and connect. For example, we can use Twitter. There you can let me know all the things that you're doing. What are your updates? What's your latest challenge that you're facing? As I was asking recently through the subscribed newsletter that we have free as well. What questions you may have for future guests. Even you can ask me for some help. Maybe I can do that as well. You can find my Twitter account very easily as professorgain.com/Twitter. You go to that link, you click it there, and it'll send you directly to my account. I'm always sharing content on gamification, as you know, especially around education and learning, which is kind of my obsession. But of course, it also has more broad topics on gamification and game-based learning as well. And before you click continue, please remember to subscribe or follow using your favorite podcast app. Doing that is completely for free. And that way you will be able to listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.